Yushchenko managed to pin a medal on the prosecutor who had failed to protect Longadze and refused to listen to things that were being said. So I didn't see any difference between the approach of Kuchma and the approach of Yushchenko to that case. So I think it's too easy to kind of go on a stereotype. You've got nice pro-Western politicians who are all in favour of the freedom of the media, and other politicians who are not. I just think that's a little simple. And the final point I'd like to make is just picking up on what Georgi talked about, the internet and so on. I mean, I actually feel I feel hugely optimistic about the internet. I mean, I'm sure we could have said things about the limitations on the internet and so on if we'd had a meeting about North Africa 3 or 4 months ago and how wrong we would have turned out to be. And I'm not saying I expect North Africa type events to happen in Russia tomorrow, but certainly when I was researching my second book, which was about modern-day Russia, I mean, the extent of social movement today, you mentioned the Khimki thing, the movements about flats being built too close to each other, the movements about Butova, the suburb of Moscow which somebody was property developers were trying to knock down, there's movements over welfare benefits and so on. There's a huge amount going on, and I think the internet is very central to it, and I think the Russians who are 20 or 30 years younger than me relate to the world in a very different way, as people here who are 20 or 30 years younger than me relate to the world in a very different way. And I think that's about the internet, which is essentially is completely free. And so I end on that very optimistic note.
Many thanks. Voice over here. Is there a microphone?
William Horsley, journalist, formerly at BBC. I'd be glad to know I'm going to ask a question. To what extent has the timidity, intimidation, collaboration, appeasement of Western leaders, and indeed Luke was suggesting Western correspondents in Moscow, encouraged this scene, landscape that we now see in Russia? I recall in '99, when Putin was just Prime Minister, I was in Helsinki for an EU-Russia summit, at which Putin simply faced down the West. At that time, there were threats of sanctions against Russia in '99 and 2000 over Chechnya and other things. Putin simply faced them down, told them, mind their own business, and they did. And they took away the list of sanctions. There was also the occasion when a Le Monde correspondent asked an unwanted question and was invited to come to Moscow, where he'd be circumcised and nothing would grow back. And the next very obvious one was Putin's talk about Anna Politkovskaya, a person of very little consequence in Russia, etc. And in each of the occasions when Western leaders are with Putin or the others, one does notice that there tends to be a lack of courage in standing up to him. I know that there are exceptions, sometimes and so on, but what's your comment on what more, perhaps, you would expect the West to do in terms of its response to this kind of Russia?
Thanks, William. Let me just take one more and then come back to the panel, if I may.
Marsha Carr, former BBC, now I write for the website Rights in Russia. I was very relieved that Luke Harding spoke about the self-censorship of Western journalists in Russia, because as a Russian living here, I feel this to be the case very, very often. And obviously what happened to Luke Harding was very much an attempt on the part of the Russian government to make an example of you and to intimidate the journalists even further. Now, I've got two questions related to it. What do you think public in Britain and in the West generally should know about Russia that they do not know, should try to understand about Russia that they do not understand and probably can't understand from the reports that are published today regularly? And the second question is partially related to what William Horsley asked, and that is, we know that in your case, in Parliament, Chris Bryant and other people were saying very vehemently that we should show Lavrov when he comes here that he would be very unwelcome. after this episode with the British correspondent. Now, this was a very powerful and unprecedented interference, which probably made Russia slightly go back. Again, what do you think, in less extraordinary circumstances than yours, British government and British public could do to make its people and its politicians know more about Russia? Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Masha. Simon, who spoke first, gave some hope at the end, rather like Georgi, that the net might cut against the tendencies. Perhaps you want to take that up first, Georgi? Or whatever you want to respond to.
For me, it's quite difficult to tell what the West could do more to influence Russia, because there are two Russias. The one Russia is the Russian elite. The elite has some real estate in the West, some accounts in the Western banks, and a lot of business with Western countries. So they interact actually with the Russian elite quite successfully. The other team is the Russian population, the other Russia, which is generally unknown of modern social practice. Because only about 12 million Russians do have foreign passports. Only 5 million Russians do regularly travel abroad. Probably for the other Russia, my answer would be the more levels, spheres, forms of interaction with the West, the better it would be. I often say that when a couple of young people from the city of Perm, let's say, would have an opportunity to travel to a weekend to Prague to drink beer, just to drink beer, in 10 years there will be another country. It will be different from the one we have now.
Well, on what is different between Yeltsin's Russia and Putin's Russia. In fact, I think the difference is huge. I can't see what Ukraine has to do with it, frankly, but it depends on what you're comparing. Today's regime in Russia is that of political monopoly. Yeltsin's regime was that of vicious political competition and irreconcilable opposition who saw its raison d'etre of saying no to whatever Yeltsin wanted to do. This is a very different political environment. Call it political pluralism or otherwise, it is very different from what we have today. And it was certainly different for the media. And let me cite just one example. The war in Chechnya was, I think, a major mistake Yeltsin committed. There were things that he could not have avoided, but this I think he could have and didn't. But what Russian television, and especially the MTV channel that you mentioned, did to Russia was pretty much what young American journalists did at the time of the Vietnam War. And that was bringing the war to Russians' sitting rooms, to the apartments of people in Russia, which generated very powerful anti-war sentiments in Russia to the extent that Yeltsin was forced to end the war. This is quite something. This is accountability that we don't have today. So if we look from this perspective, I think it is indeed very different. Talking about the web, I think I would not even agree that this is a substitute for politics. I think this is a means, and it doesn't generate for you that's not there. Once there's a political drive, there's a drive to get to the streets like in North Africa, then new media come in very useful. However, we remember the days in Russia when we had hundreds of thousands in the streets of Moscow and internet didn't exist for all practical purposes, at least didn't exist for the Muscovites. And actually, powerful public movements existed long before, I think hundreds and thousands of years before the internet. So it comes in very useful when there is when there is a political drive, which in Russia it doesn't exist at the time. So to say that we should be hugely optimistic about the web, I would disagree with that. I think it is useful. It changes the Russian society in that it's very easy for people to organize for whatever they want to do. But for the time being, they want to do a lot of interesting and good things. And I think you rightly mentioned charity effort that is very powerful and a very powerful development in Russia. And this is, by the way, Masha, something that I think people abroad don't know much about. How many means of organization there are today, and how much good work is being done by the Russian people for themselves, and not necessarily selfishly so. Now, talking about what the West can do and whether, I don't know, the Western leaders should stand firm to Putin, frankly, I don't see any leverage that the West has against Russia, and I don't see any unity, especially in the European Union. I mean, what is it that, what is the consensus there? If there were a consensus, even so, I think the leverage is tiny, if existent at all. There is a lot the West wants from Russia, maybe more the United States than Europe, but there was the START treaty that President Obama wanted so much that, in fact, he lost all leverage even if he had it at the beginning. What's your bargaining power? This is not how diplomacy works, right? If you want that party something to deliver, then you cannot exert pressure. Or it probably takes such diplomatic sophistication that is missing in the West today. There were sanctions on Iran. The United States were so eager to get Russia on board and finally did up to a point. Again, this reduces the leverage that could be there, but probably won't. And then I totally agree with what Georgi said. I think alienating Russia and isolating Russia would not do Russia good. And the current leadership, at least, enjoys huge support of the population, especially when it stands up to criticism from the West. Nothing makes Putin as popular as saying they only criticize us to do harm to us. They have ulterior motives in what they pretend is criticism of democracy and human rights. And when it comes to trying to exert pressure on Putin, he demonstrated time and time again that he's ready to sacrifice Russian national interest for the sake of staying firm and proud. This is not to, I'm not a fan of Putin, I'm not a fan of the Russian government, but this is something to consider. So the more pressure there is, the less effect in the right direction. But engagement in the long run might draw some results, if on the Russian part there is a response to that